Welcome to Table Talk, the place for deep conversations in the Geekverse. And trust me, when we tear into a subject, we go deep. I'm Heath, and I'll be your host. Each episode, I'll be talking with one or more creators, authors, illustrators, publishers, or other movers and shakers in games, TV, books, movies, or other areas of the Geekverse. Regular guests include Douglas A. Burton, the author of Faraway Bird, a multi-award-winning historical fiction novel of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. He's also the author of The Heroine's Labyrinth, an alternative story structure to the hero's journey that often occurs in stories with feminine heroes. That structural framework frequently comes up in our analysis of story. Brianna De Silva, she's the director and co-writer of The Cultists, a Lovecraftian comedy mockumentary-style web show here on YouTube, and the author of The City of Reckoning, an epic fantasy novel of political intrigue, the ethics of war, and young love. Cameron Pasha is a screenwriter, director, novelist, and was a writer and producer on the series Kings, a producer on NBC's Bionic Woman, and a co-producer and writer for Sleeper Cell. He's also written for the CW series Nikita and Roswell, New Mexico. He's been breaking news from inside Lucasfilm, Disney, and Hollywood. His analysis and commentary have become very popular on YouTube. We regularly meet to discuss and analyze stories, and when we do, we dive into graduate-level seminars on story structure and writing. Come on in and let's go deep. And when I say we're going deep, I mean you'd better bring your hard suit. Other guests have included Lou Anders, the author of the Thrones and Bones fantasy novels Once Upon a Unicorn, the creator and publisher of the Norengard RPG, and the author of Star Wars, A Pirate's Price, the book that explains why the Millennium Falcon is on the planet Batu at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Mark Tassin, the creator of the World of Ataltis, head of Mechanical Muse, former director of the Gen Con Writers Symposium, and the head developer of the new Cool Name RPG. Let's see, who else?
Bond. James Bond.
Well, not James Bond. Not yet. Maybe soon, though. But I have interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, the founder of Stonemaier Games, crowdfunder extraordinaire, and publisher of many hit board games like Scythe and Wingspan. Brian Colin, sculptor of the world of Revelo Monster Busts, and the creator of the vast grim dark horror RPG. Ajit George, the Dungeons & Dragons author. We talked about game writing, education, and his contribution to Van Richter's Guide to Ravenloft and the development of the Journeys to the Radiant Citadel.
I am Hela, Odin's firstborn, the commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne and the goddess of death.
Well, actually, that interview got rather spicy, so I think I'd better just keep that one to myself. Kate Wilson, a YouTuber, actress, host, and prolific geek guru who's now working to make a new show dedicated to the world of tabletop gaming a reality. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride, because it's time to explore the worlds of tabletop gaming, sci-fi, fantasy, and all of geekdom through the eyes of those who are making things happen.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger, ready to move out.
It's time for Table Talk. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my home. Welcome to the office. Welcome to Table Talk at a very special time, unusual time this afternoon. We're going to be talking about the Christmas story again today, and the story that I wrote based on it, The Trial of St. Gabriel. I've got a proof right here. We did an extensive stream last Tuesday with Brianna and Cameron talking about the Christmas story. Lots of information there. It was very dense. We talked about a lot of things. It was a long stream, but Doug didn't get to be there last Tuesday. And so, but he had material and we've got things to talk about. And so we've decided to do this auxiliary stream, Table Talk auxiliary stream today, so that Doug and I can have the conversation on the subject. And so everyone, please welcome Douglas A. Burton. Hello.
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
Good to see you. Thank you, Doug, for being here this afternoon.
Oh, no problem.
taking some time to continue with this conversation because it was a big one. I was
able to listen into some of it, and I was able to catch a lot of it later and listen into that. And I was just fascinated by the discussion, and it seemed to be a pretty engaging topic. And having read your story, The Trial of St. Gabriel, which renewed my interest in, Christian theology and folklore and, the stories behind the religion. I just wished I could have been there. But I'm glad we can do an auxiliary. I think you called it stream. Engage auxiliary stream.
First of all, I'll bring this up. One of the reasons that you know about this subject is because you were well researched it, as I was telling everybody in the Discord server, because of this novel.
Yes. As many of you know, I'm the author of Faraway Bird, which is a historical fiction novel that takes place in the 6th century in the Byzantine Empire. And one of the most fascinating things about Byzantine history to me was the more I got to know about it, the more I unearthed this period of time, which is the end of paganism, the end of antiquity, and the rise of Christianity and the rise of the medieval era. So the 6th century in Constantinople is on the very pulse of where these changes are occurring. And when you start to unpack what's there, what's happening in this city, who's who, what is religion, what does Christianity mean? I found such a wide spectrum of doctrines, Christian doctrines at work, and competing philosophies, including the end of paganism through the School of Athens and everything. So this is a topic that is fascinating to me. And one of the core discussions of theology at that time relates to Heath's story in the sense that there's this idea of merging divinity and humanity together in Jesus. And that becomes the core of some of the most hotly debated topics in Christian theology. So I've read a lot about it. It's very hard to characterize in fiction because some of it is very alien to us today. And yet when you dive into the discussion, you're like, man, I wish I could have heard that this was the debate. This is a great debate. I wish I would have known about it. So anyway, that's it is relevant to the kind of writing I do.
And so now we got 55 hours left in the Kickstarter of the Trial of St. Gabriel. This is my short story about about the nativity story, the Christmas story. I do love Christmas. It's an important holiday for all kinds of reasons, of course, but especially in the family, of course, getting together for Christmas. That's always been something that's been present in my family ever since childhood. And for some reason, I have a lot of different stories that I would themed around Christmas. This was the first one that I ever wrote, and we'll talk about an earlier version of it years and years ago. But I've been meaning to get and wanting to get a Christmas story out every Christmas for like 3 or 4 years. And for different reasons, it never happened. It didn't happen. But this time I was like, you know what? So several weeks ago, a couple months ago, I was like, I'm going to make this happen now. I'm going to get this story. I've had this theme of going back to the beginning of things. So it's like, was my original idea that I had when I had this idea and this interest in warrior angels. And I said, I'm returning to this story and I'm going to get it out by this Christmas. And so I can start this. Maybe I can do a Christmas story every year or something for it until they're out. But this one's the first one. So I made it happen. It is happening.
Nice.
So this is the Trial of St. Gabriel. It tells the story of the Nativity, but it tells it basically from the perspective of a warrior angel culture. The main character is Gabriel here, who tells both Mary and Joseph that of the birth of Christ and goes through this, but deals with parts of the story that are not typically dealt with, particularly the massacre in Bethlehem. That Herod perpetrated in order to try to kill the baby Jesus. And so I was trying to, you read that, it's not something we deal with a lot today. It's not something we talk about today. What does that mean? And I had questions about it as I was writing it even. I was like, the questions I had needed to be the questions that the story needed to address. And that's how it evolved. So we're talking about stories that will help you get a perspective on something that you don't often think about. That's what I was trying to do here. So if you would like that, there are ebook copies. And then also I got a new proof. This is the first proof. I've got a second proof of the physical ones, a physical book coming. And I would love to have you on Kickstarter. The ebooks will go out just as soon as the Kickstarter is over. So you will have it for Christmas and all of that. Then I'll have the physical books printed up. But come by. Last 55 hours. I would love to have you as part of the Kickstarter as we are going here, because we do things on this channel. We're people
Yes.
who do things. So,
well, and I'll say I am one of the backers of this project, and I have read an earlier draft of this, which is pretty close to the final draft, if I recall. Is that right, Heath?
Yes, you read something. There was he was a beta reader for an earlier one. And I had revised a lot of it based on Doug's discussion, but it was pretty close. It's pretty close to the.
Okay, yeah, and I'll say it is excellent. I didn't know, to be perfectly blunt, I did not know if I would like it. I did not know, because I was like, well, this is going into some deep lore. And I understand, even as a historical fiction writer, when I tell people I write in the 6th century, people are like, it's the further back you go, the harder it is for people to think they're going to be able to connect to the story. So sometimes they pass and they look for something, maybe World War II, maybe something a little bit more recent and easier to identify. So, same thing. When I saw this, I was like, oh, we're going all the way back. We're going into some deep theology and Christian lore. And when I read it, I found myself completely sucked in and captivated by it. My original intention was to go through and make notes on a couple pages. And before you know it, I was at the end, feverishly typing my thoughts. So it's a great story, and I highly recommend it. And I think that if you get it, you'll enjoy it. And I think it'll do for you what it did for me, which is renew my fascination with Christian theology, religious storytelling, and all the dimensions that brings with it. And the Trial of St. Gabriel kind of renews that. And I think also specifically because it does come in from an angle that it's almost like you're passing over a part of the territory you hadn't seen before. So anyway, I just strongly recommend it. It's a great story.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So I think we could start as kind of an extension, like the story as an extension of the conversation that we had on Tuesday, since I was in it and I was rewatching it as I was editing clips. There are going to be clips that come out from it. And then Doug was listening to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we had this idea, 2 ideas that came up at the end that I wanted to think more about and have been thinking more about. The first is understanding when you're trying to get a hold of what this story means and what the theme of this story is, when you're reading the Christmas story, being that there are 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, that have these very different elements, that to different audiences, understanding them in their context, which includes not only who the audiences of both of those books were written for, but also, I think this was Robert who brought this up, understanding, if you're having trouble understanding the meaning of the beginning, the birth of Christ, maybe it's because you haven't gotten all the way to the end yet. We've talked about that sometimes on this when we're talking about analyzing a story like Arcane. We were talking about Arcane. Like, well, on the other hand, this is the first season. If we're trying to talk about character arcs and its meaning and all of that, we did say, well, there is something to come later too, or even Star Wars, that some elements show up in later shows, later movies, not the original, even that's classics hero journey.
Correct.
So, go ahead.
Well, real quick, I was going to say that happens all the time where I remember when Empire Strikes Back came out, and I remember listening to my dad talk with his old college roommate who became a movie reviewer. His name is Mike Polis, and they were discussing Empire Strikes Back. And at the time, they weren't really sure they liked it as much because it didn't have much of an ending. Of course, their opinions completely switched after they saw Return of the Jedi, because now that part of the story had the correct context. We saw how the story ended. We understood Empire Strikes Back as the middle of a trilogy. The whole thing changed once we got to the end of the story of Return of the Jedi. And now Empire Strikes Back is often cited as everyone's favorite movie. Similarly, on the opposite side, with the sequel trilogy, I was relatively positive toward Force Awakens. But having seen how the story went and how it ended, it's unwatchable now. I cannot turn on Force Awakens and watch it anymore because it means nothing. It's gibberish compared to the end of the story. So to your point, the end of the story sometimes adds the proper context to the middle of the story, or I think you were even saying earlier, like, is this the beginning of the story, or
is this even the beginning?
Is there the prequels that we should be focusing on to understand the middle part of this story, etc. So I agree with you that the totality of the story changes the context of all those beats along the way. And that's why it's so important to end a story. But just as an aside, that's why it's so important to end well. Because if you can't end it, then all that came before. Look what happened to Game of Thrones.
I was about to say, well, there are two lessons for that. First of all, end it well, the TV show. And if you're talking about the books, it is important to end it.
You have to finish the story.
If the ending is going to be important to having derived meaning in the beginning,
correct,
then having the end is critical.
It's pretty important to the whole act 3 structure.
Let's see. So Robert on this theme was saying, right, so the holy birth might not mean much if Jesus doesn't die and is resurrected to reopen the gates of paradise. He says, I liken it to nobody caring about Romulus and Remus being floated down a basket in a river and raised by wolves if Romulus doesn't kill Remus and found Rome.
Yeah.
But when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, okay, fair enough. It's like, okay, yes. Okay, let's just tell the birth of Romulus and Remus, or let's just hear the story of the birth of Moses, because Moses also has an origin story that is very similar to what Matthew talks about. I think deliberately equating Jesus and Moses. But if you just read the birth of Moses, okay, what's your great point that you're supposed to be getting out of the story of the birth of Moses? I mean, there may be some things, but you're reading Act 1, right. And you're not getting the whole thing. So that could be the case here. But even when that came up, I was like, hey, no, wait a minute. What then is the correct content, or what is the end? You could say, well, it's these books. In order to you should read, or maybe hypothesis here, that if you read all of the book of Matthew, then you understand the birth of Christ as Matthew relates it, in its full context, and that the whole work is the book of Matthew. Likewise, you could say then when you're reading the birth of Christ according to Luke, the entire book of Luke is its context. That's giving you the entire arc.
Right.
On the other hand, Luke and Acts go together. So they run together. That why are the apostles doing all of their acts anyway? Well, it's because of what had happened during Christ's life and then going off and then preaching after that. So the end of the story, as far as Luke's concerned, especially for those who have a philosophy of the unity kind of the book of Luke and book of Acts, they go together, that, well, the end of the story is kind of at the book of Acts then. When Robert had originally said that, I thought, well, the end of the story is Revelation. That maybe there's something that once you read the book of Revelation, then you're like, oh, now I understand all of Christ. But then on the other hand, I was like, I'm not even sure this is the beginning, because people talk about Jesus as the second Adam, and the importance of this. So then I was like, no, well, wait a minute. I'm not even sure that I'm at the beginning. That if the beginning is the book of Genesis, like, does that which came before inform your understanding of the birth of Jesus in either of these two books?
Well, so, and that does come into play with some of the discussion I'll have later. Because if Jesus is conceived or begotten at a certain point in history, and he wasn't there for Genesis, then you have two divinities. That is not monotheism. And that was a major, major problem that was being dealt with Christian doctrines across the Western world, and I would say Middle East, even into the Caucasus, Ethiopia, North Africa. That whole area was dealing with this, because if it is indeed a monotheistic religion, then how do we have a father and a son? That's polytheism. That's more than one God. So this was an issue. So when you're saying, where does it begin? Well, it has to begin at Genesis, because if the theology is correct, then Jesus began also at the beginning, because he was, I think they call it co-eternal, which again is an odd wording, because it still implies two or more. But the idea in terms of religious doctrine is that Jesus was eternal and began with and as God. And then and I think your story actually covers it rather well. I think God says in your story, I will be born through this woman, or, I will be, So he describes it as though it's just an extension of him in this one like off ramp,
That's how I wrote it in the story. That yes.
Well, and that's important because, and there were riots in this when people suggested that God or Jesus started or is subordinate or secondary or a son or a servant. Suggesting this erases the fact that he is God, and that would cause riots. And I'm talking some massive riots in Christian cities during these debates. So where it begins technically should still be Genesis, if Jesus is eternal and God and inseparable from God.
Hey, we got more people coming in. I see, by the way.
What's up, everybody?
Say hi to everybody who's coming in. Hi, and Vision's coming in, catching up. Good to see everybody. James is saying that the things we're talking about still an issue today.
It is.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, I think you handled it very well in your story. I would say, according to mainstream Christian theology, it fits with that. And, those are little details that may go unnoticed by most people because most of us are only introduced to the mainstream discussions or the denomination that we're raised in. And so we don't even think about it. We don't even think about it. And then we find out there's these other takes and you're like, whoa, what? You're like, oh my God, that's even a good take. That's interesting. You were even saying like the idea of writing a story and, at the time, in the era of antiquity when gods were like Mount Olympus and thunder and Zeus and Mercury and Jupiter and Apollo coming in on a chariot. Here's the story of this is a guy, it's got all this huge buildup, right? God's going to be born on earth in like a garage.
Right.
Like this completely, like if it was today, it'd be like, oh yeah, in some guy's garage. It's like, what? It's such a contrast to the type of lofty God stories of the Greeks and the Romans that when you hear this, like this big buildup with this real humble delivery, it's jarring. And I can't even imagine back then how jarring that must have been and how compelling that must have been as like the plot twist, just from a pure storytelling standpoint.
And from a story educational standpoint as well, when we're talking about these stories, when you're thinking, what am I supposed to get out of this? Well, we have different holidays where we tell different stories. But
Yeah.
If you're looking at this holistically, then okay, you tell the origin story at Christmas. At Easter, you're going to tell the resurrection. And so each individual part is the whole is greater than any of those parts that you're trying to put together, at least according to this,
Yes.
this comprehensive look at this. So it's like, well, what are you supposed to be getting out of this one? Well, you're learning part of the story that you're to be told in context over a whole bunch of different holidays throughout this. But I don't ever also remember that being a big part of the storytelling and the religious education during any of those points either. So if you're thinking, what is, which we've talked about an inadequacy of, we think religious education on this stream before, this channel before, that even today, I don't think it ties it all together all that well. I mean, of course, if you're looking for a big message of Christianity, okay, you've got this sacrifice for your sins. If you accept this, then you get to live for eternity after you die in heaven. Okay. That's not a great message of story. I mean, it is a great message of storytelling if you, in one sense, in religious sense. But on the other hand, when you're talking about some of the great themes that we've been struggling with and talking about stories that are going back and forth on some type of important theme, what is that one? I'm not sure.
Well, it's almost like with Star Wars, they made a lot of money off the movie, but he made even more money off the merchandise. And a lot of modern companies view the IP as simply the starting point for all these other things that they could sell. The books, the merchandise, the extra movie experience, the collectibles, the comic books, all these other things, right? These peripheral, the toys. So in a way, I think sometimes the story doesn't have to be perfectly complete because it's like, here's the story, But the merchandise, in a sense, is like, you're going to live your life according to this. This is a moral code that you're going to attempt to live out in your life. So these are the stories. This is the IP, but the final product is how you live your life. So I think sometimes we tell these stories in order to get to that, the merchandising section of it, which is the bigger part of the picture, which is a way to not only your life, but how to order society, how to write your laws into legal, so those are all the byproducts of the story. And I think that, that's one way to look at it too, is the stories are the source code. And then you've got the larger byproducts of that story, if you believe the story or a fan of the story.
When we also had this idea that I've been thinking a lot about, but I haven't come up with an ultimate answer on this either, that when Brianna and I were discussing at the end, and she's in the chat, I see, but that, okay, if you created these stories, Matthew and Luke, actually, by the way, before we were talking about the end of things, and is this important, the beginning important to the end? Another counter to that would be that 2 of the Gospels don't even mention the birth of Christ. So if this is an essential part of understanding the end, 2 out of the 4 didn't think so. Can you get the message of the other Gospels? You got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just Matthew and Luke tell the story of the miraculous birth and all of that. And so if that's an important part of it, well, then can you tell the story without it? Well, 2 of the 4 say you can, right? They don't mention it.
Yeah.
So that's another thing to think about as far as like the what theme you're supposed to be getting out of it. According to some people, it may not even matter for the end of the story. But what I was saying with the hybrid was, if we're looking at Matthew and Luke in the context of their audience and what they are trying to get across, Matthew, written for a Jewish audience under Roman rule, looking for to be saved from that physically, under Roman rule. That's what, Moses, they have experience with that before in their storytelling. You've got Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt. Well, coming to save them from physical rule, material rule right there. Need that again, associate this new character with Moses through that. This is what may happen again. Luke's audience to more educated Greeks and Romans, which is more like what a lot of people today are, not first century Jews under Roman rule, but here this is talking to somebody else who's outside of that. So a lot of what we get in our modern story comes from Luke, but with a splash of some of the cooler parts of Matthew, basically the flashiest parts of Matthew. The star, very iconic. So you put the star in. The wise men, I mean, they're fantastically costumed, right? So those are some great characters. The rich guys bringing in gifts in the cool costumes. So when you put together your nativity set, put the star up there, that's bright and shiny. Put these really cool costumed guys to contrast with your shepherds that are coming up. So you grab those and you put them together. And in this, possibly in the same way that they, the original authors, who we call Matthew and Luke, were trying to come up with reconciling the story that they had heard, telling for a particular audience, perhaps, and you can read about how certain gospels may have referenced other gospels and also referenced other material that had come together, they had drawn together, some of which had been lost, some of which we have. We are kind of doing that again today when you have the hybrid story. Well, we can draw from Matthew and we can draw from Luke. What's important to us? Well, important to us for what reasons? One of them is just plain history, that things like and Western culture, if you see paintings of, the famous Renaissance artists, and they're doing their painting of Virgin Mary and the Christ, or the wise men in the stable and all that, and you're wondering, what are all these things? Well, one reason to include all of that in the story would be for historical reference. Say, hey, you're growing up in this culture, kid. Here's some stuff you're going to see. So here's why you're seeing it. But also, I think it'd be interesting and I don't have the answer to this, but if you're thinking, well, the modern audience today, like people in Western civilization over the past 100 years, or whatever. I'm not exactly sure when, if you were reading stories about this kind of hybrid amalgam, what message is that trying to get across? And I'm still not sure. But it's interesting potentially to look at the hybrid as an extension of of the way religious texts might have been constructed in their time, taking things from sources that are relevant to you, putting them together, mixing it up, coming up with something new that's potentially relevant. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the hybrid theory is probably correct, because I think what happens is you have different interpretations of the story. And sometimes one interpretation can lead to huge differences. For example, if you believe in one Christian doctrine, then this pope is important. If you believe in a different Christian doctrine, then this other pope becomes, so power can shift based on which story is adopted. So what happens, I think, is you get someone attempts to compromise two different angles to come up with a single story that brings in elements from both, and you kind of double your audience. And I don't even mean that in a crass way, but I mean, you're reconciling two different interpretations and possibly two different power bases with a story that compromises or is a hybrid version of two stories and satisfying two different audiences in that sense. And I think that specifically because in Justinian's time, he specifically, his like main goal was to come up with a single unifying story of Christianity that ended all these other denominations and all the disputes and all the riots and all the massacring and persecution going on amongst Christians by coming up with a story that made sense to most Christians. So he was attempting to reconcile, what would become the Catholic belief system with what would become the Greek Orthodox belief system. Come up with a single story or a single creed or a single scripture interpretation that satisfies both. And in order to do that, you have to kind of come up with an interpretation that might mix in two different elements to get that, I think what you're describing as a hybrid tale. I think that's a natural function of reconciling different or competing beliefs, especially when power is at stake.
When you were writing the stories about the Byzantine Empire for Empress Theodora, which is right at this time, just before the Islam, which emergence of Islam, which Cameron was talking about, you had also mentioned in our world building discussion about bringing people into that world and doing world building even in the context of historical fiction, which is not something I had thought about when I first organized that discussion, thinking in terms of fantasy world building and such. But I thought this was a great point that, hey, you're about to bring people into the 6th century of the Byzantine Empire. You need to do world building. And this is, and you even made it sounds like some kind of fantasy thing at times. If you're doing 6th century Christianity, that's really different from what people understand today as Christianity. What is Christianity?
Totally. Yeah. In fact, I was going to share with you a picture of the Adoration of the Magi, which I think I just thought it was an awesome one. Let me see if I can get it. Window. I don't know if you can share that or not. Here, let me.
Oh, I get that.
What's interesting that I wanted to point out was if you look at the flag back here, that is that blue. That is the flag of Byzantion or Byzantium. So that is the city. It was a trading city, obviously, of Byzantium that was way back when. And what's interesting is the flag of the city of Constantinople didn't change, but that they changed it to a red background, which is the flag of Turkey even today, which is amazing. Wow. That the crescent and star, which was a common motif amongst the Mediterranean world, existed a long time ago and has even been adopted, I think, into Islam in recent centuries as almost like the core symbol of it. So anyway, it's just interesting. But that's the Adoration of the Magi, and they show that, the 3 wise men who have arrived to present their gifts. Isn't that really cool? Isn't that a cool painting?
That is a really cool painting. Where does that come? When is that from?
That is It was painted in the 1600s, if I remember right. Stefan Lochner, I looked up, I think was a 17th century painter. So it is
17th century.
Yeah, it is an older painting.
But 17th century, that's still far after Byzantium. So why did he put the flag of Byzantium?
Well, because the city was still part of that region. And the city of Byzantion, which is where Constantinople was founded over, it included that symbol. So that's not the symbol of the Byzantine Empire, but it's the symbol of the city, of that region, which I think is really very unique and interesting to me that would have been around even back then. Yeah, the Byzantine Empire wasn't founded until really until the 4th century.
What is it that people? Cameron went over a whole bunch of this different debate, but what issues were they dealing with? Vision says this is an interesting stream to watch. Just coming home from church, perfect timing. It is perfect timing.
Awesome.
What then in your study then were they dealing with, and what would surprise us at that time?
Well, I was surprised almost constantly by digging into this. So, Cameron, I thought, did a fantastic job of trying to lay out a bunch of context. Most of us, I think, as Americans or Westerners are, we're born into a denomination. We understand that denomination and that denomination's interpretation of things. And we live in a mostly peaceful time in Christianity. The Christians aren't attacking each other like they were back then necessarily. So, what you believe is kind of like, to each their own is kind of the philosophy today. So we're not really threatened by other ideas. And some of these disputes have been resolved in a sense. So when I went back to do research, it became very important for me to understand that the problems they were facing, and it was bizarre because the problems they were facing were so unlike anything I had heard of. So, and Cameron, I think, did a good job of explaining how in the early parts, in the years that Jesus was alive, in the first century, that Jesus was not trying to start a new religion. He saw himself as Jewish. He saw what he was doing as part of Judaism, and in Judaism, there was the idea of the chosen people. That God had chosen the Israelites as God's people. And the good news that Jesus brought was it's kind of like Judaism for everybody. We're all the chosen people now, and that was a big deal because one of my interpretations or my understanding of it, which is very fascinating, is understanding the civil war, or I should say the war between Rome and Israel, Rome and Judea, because Rome walked around and conquered pretty much everybody. They were very militant. They were expansive as a culture. And then here they encounter the Israelite, the Jews in Judea, and they did not take very well to Roman occupation. And the emperor wanted, for example, his likeness as a statue to be put into the temple. The Jews were like, can't do that. We don't worship idols. We won't do that. And that's a non-starter. That's non-negotiable. And the emperor's like, I'm the emperor. Everything I tell you isn't only negotiable. You're going to do it. And this obviously
it's non-negotiable from the other direction.
Exactly. So this, and this caused a major contest. So when I think of it, although the Romans were able to destroy materially much of Israel, they destroyed the temple. They wiped out so much of the Jewish population. They sent them into a diaspora, dispersed throughout the region. However, the Jewish people never went away, and they seem to have something that allowed them to withstand this incredible brutalizing of the society. And that thing was their religion. So in a way, I look at it from a modern sense as this is almost like a technology. They have this idea this something there. And it's not like the pagans. Pagans were like, I could change religions. They weren't as passionate or as wild necessarily as the zealotry as it was viewed coming out of Judea. So it was almost like this religion, placing religion at the top of the hierarchy of a society gave that society some sort of an advantage, even over a superpower like Rome. So I think there was a desire for this technology to be had by other societies in a sense. Wouldn't it be nice if our society was able to do this as well? So you have this good news from Jesus that's like, hey, guess what? This technology is available for all of you. Everyone can have this. You are all the chosen people. So there was this excitement, a fervor over this. And it came through the context of the struggle from the Roman Empire and the kingdom of Judea. So, and obviously this was where Jesus fell into dispute, conflict, not only with the Roman Empire, but also with parts of Judea as well. So there was the concept of Messiah. And in Judaism, Messiah is more of a generational, it's not a one-time thing, but it's a generational thing. Someone will come by to save the Jewish people from destruction. And there were other messiahs, and there was the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century, in which he was proclaimed a messiah at times. So, all of this came together in this 1st century like that. And as the spread of this, and it was not legal in the Roman Empire, as this spread, it really started to become a separate religion. And most of that is due to the idea of how you are saved, how salvation can come, how you can get into heaven. Whereas Jews believed that you had to study the Torah, the word of God, to understand how to live and then to live according to those commandments. There's not just the 10 commandments. If you read through the entire Torah or Old Testament, there are a total of 613 commandments. If you take everything that God says and say, do this, do that, do this, do this, there's a total of 613. So this is a handbook for civilization. And in order to live and have this civilization as directed by God, you must follow the Torah or the Old Testament. And Jesus, and as the theology spread, it became you have to believe in Jesus in order to get to heaven. And that's fundamentally different from the Judaic approach, in which the idea was that no one person can be elevated above the entire community in such a permanent way. So that's where those two diverged. And then in Christian theology, it had to go underground for 200 years, and it was persecuted ruthlessly by the Roman Empire. You hear all the stories about Christians being fed to the lions, and these were true. They would do this. I had a painting of I think her name was Saint Eulalia, who was crucified and then murdered by the Romans for her belief in Christianity. So what happens, and this is where I had to understand some of this to write a Byzantine story, is in the 4th century. So it took 200 years. I mean, we're talking about 313, I think, is when Christianity becomes an official religion of the empire. That's 313 years after the birth of Christ. So quite a long time for these ideas to take hold and to spread to the point where Constantine, who was a Roman military leader and emperor, adopted this. And what I found fascinating is Constantine called that first ecumenical council, and he's like, okay, Christianity is going to be the religion of the empire. And this is huge because now this is that technology, that we are a religious society, and we will have this superpower this divinity as part of our society, as a guiding force for our society. And he got all the bishops together and he said, tell me, what is Christianity? And for 200 years, when this was all underground, a lot of different answers had formed for what that is. And so he was getting all these different answers. And what's interesting is that question, what is Christianity, was never answered decisively. And I feel like even today, we're still trying to answer the emperor's question, what it is. And what started to focus people in So where the debate really started to center was, what is the nature of Jesus Christ? Is he a hybrid? Is he half man, half God? Is he a second divinity? Because that would seem to negate the first commandment. Can you explain what Jesus is? And from the Jewish point of view, the relationship between divinity and humanity was always at arm's length. You don't mix them. You can be divinely inspired. You can talk to God. In some cases, some people who did. There are visions and messages and signs and miracles, but all over there on that side of the fence, God's doing that. We're on this side of the fence. We're human beings, and we don't really cross the streams. We might interact in some way, but the two were mostly separated. But with Jesus, suddenly you've got the Son of God. He's got divinity, he's got humanity, and reconciling that. What does that mean? The equation, the way I wrote it in my notes, there's an equation. Divinity plus humanity equals what exactly? What does that equal? Divinity plus humanity equals what? And there were a lot of different answers to that question. And I think Cameron even mentioned some of this in his stream, or when he was talking about this in the stream, that some of the answers, which pointed to Christ being more human, is what opened the door for the Islamic interpretation, where Muhammad was also human, not divine. He was divinely inspired. He was a prophet, but he was not him. He was not a god himself. And so some of the Christian answers to that was that Jesus was more human, and others were more like Jesus is more godlike. So, and what's fascinating to me, so obviously the Trinity is the answer most Christians understand today. And that is a fascinating answer, because the more I looked into the other answers, the more I was like, man, these are good answers. I looked at it more like, this is a debate, and it's an exciting, compelling debate. It's a shame that we knocked out all the other possible answers, because it would almost be interesting to have this debate even today. But the Jews became part of this discussion. Theirs was, you don't mix the two. You don't get both mixed into a single person. That would be the Jewish perspective on that. There's a separation there between divinity and humanity. And I think Cameron mentioned one of the groups was the Arians. And the Arians' answer to this was divinity plus humanity equals what? They called it a logos, which is 100% divinity. Jesus would be 100% divine, but he was begotten by God. Therefore, he is viewed as a second divinity, a son. Like there is a distinction between a father and a son. So you have two separate divinities, and that God. So Jesus is a servant of God. Mary is mother of Christ. And these are very important semantics at the time, because the Catholics, mother of God, right? Cameron mentioned another answer is God bearer. Mary is a God bearer. So this is where they burrowed down to these exact phrases to figure out what is what. So the Arians said Jesus is a servant of God, the Son of God, but as a second begotten. He didn't start at Genesis the same way that other doctrines interpret it, that he came into the world. He was created by God and is therefore subordinate to the Father. And this is considered heretical because it creates two divinities, Jesus and God, two separate entities, separate, definable, which is then polytheism. It's no longer monotheism.
I was thinking of the Nicene Creed, which says that Christ is begotten, not made.
Right, but
part of that.
Right. So that, I think, is an attempt to reconcile some of this discussion, because the Nicene Creed also says some other things that are much more definitive and much more critical, I would say, to modern doctrine. Yeah, he proceeds from the Father. So, in fact, one of the big revolts that took place in Constantinople, one of the emperors changed the doctrine from Jesus is from God versus Jesus is of God. that one word, from versus of, rebellion, total revolt. Buildings were burned, massive riots were done, and the emperor had to recant that change in the doctrine, the word from to of, because it had such different connotations. So anyway, so here's the thing. So the Arians tell you one story, that God is begotten, but as subordinate, a servant of God. And this was like, no. But if you believe that story, if that's the doctrine you adhere to, then you empowered a different group of Christian theologians, the Arians. Their home city was mainly Antioch at the early part, and later Ravenna. And the Arians became the belief system of a lot of the Proto-Europeans. King Theodoric, the barbarians that sacked Rome and then lived there in Italy, they were Arians. Constantine even converted to Arianism, I think, near the end. So Arianism was rampant in Italy, rampant in Germany, rampant in Spain. Arianism was all over the place. And what's interesting is Rome, which is where the Pope was not Arian. This is the future Catholic center, and they held their guns. They held to their guns, even though they were surrounded by Arians. They disagreed, and they still said that Arianism was heresy. But that disempowered the tenets of Arianism. But anyway, servant of God, two divinities, mother of Christ was the Arian belief system. Another answer, they're called the monophysites, and they believe that Christ had one nature. That literally is what monophysite means. Their solution to the equation was divinity plus humanity equals a divine being, which is 100% human. Their position was Christ was human. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. If he's all divine, then he's not really living or understanding humanity. So in their view, Christ was 100% human being, no different than you and me. But he had divine qualities, divine aspects to him, as part of God. But he had this one nature, and it was mainly humanity. It was mainly that he was a human being. And to Cameron's point, this was one of the belief systems that if you believe that divinity is also can be found in a human being, but you lean more on the God, Jesus was human side, this would be a little bit more relatable to Islam in the future centuries.
That makes me wonder. I was just thinking as you were commenting on this, that we had talked about and Cameron had talked about last time, the difference between the angel coming in a dream and the angel coming physically.
Yes.
And the angel that was coming physically is the one that's written for the Greeks that have this experience with Greek and Roman mythology and those type of characters that appear and interact with humans in that mythology. But also you're talking about what's the different, or what does a God plus human mean? If you're telling somebody this kind of story that has a background, like a cultural history in Roman or Greek mythology, and you've got Hercules, one answer is like Hercules. Like if you've got God and you're adding, you end up with Hercules. So they would have a different understanding of that. And I haven't thought, I don't know where that leads, but now I'd like to read into if when Luke is writing to a Greek audience, if the idea is more like Jesus, then is more like Hercules. I mean, he's not in the strong sense, but but that's what he is. I wonder if that's anything there.
I think that's why Arianism is a little bit like that, like the superpowered divinity who looks like they're human. Because the answer by the Arians was divinity plus humanity equals the logos, a Greek word, which is 100% divinity in a human form, like Hercules. And you got this in where the old Roman Empire, because by this point in my storytelling, 6th century, the Roman Empire in the West had just freshly collapsed. The barbarians who overran it are still there. They just set up shop. They're ruling out of Rome. They're Arians. So it's just interesting to what your point is, the idea that there would be it would be easier to understand Jesus in the context of Hercules 100% divinity, but in the physical shape of a human, but clearly a second God. And to pagans, multiple gods isn't a problem for them. Who cares if there's two? Obviously, this is the Son. That's the Father. Why does it have to be one? I don't understand. So it's easier for them to understand it that way. I actually never thought about it like that, but it makes perfect sense. And what is also crazy is, so Theodora, the Byzantine empress, she was a monophysite, which was the second version that I was talking about, which was taught in Egypt. The home city was Alexandria. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there was another pope there. There was another pope. And in fact, we call the pope in Rome the first among equals. So the idea was that there's these other popes, and there were multiple popes, but the pope in Rome is number one. Like, he's the first among equals. One of the other popes, they call him the Alexandrine Pope, who's a character in my story. He ends up showing up at one point because Theodora meets him in real life. And in history, it's strongly suggested that because she converted to monophysite, and this pope was a monophysite. So he taught this belief that Jesus was 100% human, that's vital. Otherwise, the experiment God is having, being human, wouldn't matter if he wasn't really human. If he was all divinity, then this is pointless. You don't need to do this. This is a waste of time. So their belief was that Jesus was 100% human being, which really humanized him. And also he had divine abilities. There was divinity through some of his abilities in that sense. And they called Jesus is the Son of God. That was their phrasing. Mary is God bearer. So I think that's similar to how your story portrays her, the bearer of God, right? He literally like a vessel almost.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Right. So that was the monophysites, and they had their own pope. And I think this version of Christianity has become what is the modern Coptic church, which is still found in a lot of these regions in a lot of Muslim countries where there's a Christian population. You still will find the Coptic church in North Africa, Egypt, Syria, the Middle East. So they didn't disappear. We just haven't heard about them much because they really fell out of the sphere of Christianity as Islam kind of spread over into those areas. And then another one, which is related to what Cameron was talking about, the kind of, I don't know if you would call it Christian or Islam adjacent, but it was the idea that there was a more humanity to Christ, and that was the Nestorians. And the Nestorians, their answer to the question was, and this is interesting, divinity plus humanity equals hypostatic union, which is Jesus was 100% human and 100% divinity simultaneously. Basically, Trinity minus one. There's no Holy Spirit, but that Jesus is superimposed as both 100% God and 100% humanity. So that this solves the problem of Jesus's humanity meaning something, because he's 100% human, but he's also 100% divine, that he is part of God and co-eternal with God. So this is essentially the Trinity of just two, 100% and 100% simultaneously. And the Nestorians, they believe Jesus is a divine person, and Mary is, again, God bearer. Those were the phraseology. And their home city was in Antioch, which is modern day Syria. And they spread heavily into the east, into the Caucasus, even as far as China. There was a pagoda that had this theology from the Nestorians. It's really bizarre. In India, this is where a lot of the Christianity made its way into India, was from the Nestorians. And they have become what's known today as the Church of the East, which is still present and still relevant. And then, of course, we come to what became European, which is the Western Chalcedonians, as they were known, which is the idea that Christ doesn't have one nature like the monophysites. He doesn't have two natures like the Nestorian. Christ has three natures, the Trinity, where God is one. Jesus is 100% God, 100% human, and 100% Holy Spirit simultaneously, the Trinity. And that was their solution to this equation. and Jesus is God, indistinguishable, because he's one and the same. There's not two divinities. There is one divinity. So Jesus is God. Another phrasing they used was the Godhead. There was a Godhead and it had three faces. And Mary is the mother of God, not the mother of Christ, not a God bearer, but the mother of God. That was the phrasing. Their leader was the Pope in Rome. And this obviously is Catholicism. This is what becomes Catholicism. And what's interesting is the Eastern Chalcedonians, the Byzantines, agreed. And Justinian was vital to this because he's the one that reconciled between Rome and Constantinople. And the odd man out was the Monophysites. They're like, you're done. So they started prosecuting Monophysites at that point, and they made a deal. And the Pope in Rome and Constantinople started to see eye to eye. However, the big dispute between them, so they agreed in the Trinity. The Eastern Chalcedonians, they agreed Jesus is God, Mary is the mother of God, and however, their leader was the Patriarch in Constantinople. So their dispute started to become, well, who's really in charge? You in Rome, you're surrounded by Arians, you're not even part of the empire. It's really hard to do much out there. We're really the administrative center of the empire. We should really be the beating heart of Christianity. And Justinian builds the Hagia Sophia in this era, which is the world's largest enclosed structure, I think until the 1800s. One of the largest domes, massive building, the heart of Christianity until 1453 when the Turks took it. So Constantinople felt they should still be in charge. And this is what led to the Great Schism. So even though they both agreed on the Trinity, they couldn't agree on who was in charge. And you had the Catholic Pope in Europe, and then you had the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople became Greek Orthodoxy and later Russian Orthodoxy. And then, of course, in Western Europe, the Pope, Catholicism, expanded and flourished and became a dominant part of Christianity. What's even more interesting is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was really the building of Christianity for like 1,000 years. When the Turks had almost 1,000 years, when the Turks came in and took it, they did not destroy it or desecrate it. Cameron was right. They were very respectful of the Christian church. They would not let anyone sack it. But that church was now a mosque and it was part of Islam. That's when the construction of the Vatican really began. I think it was Pope Nicholas, like literally in the 1450s, was like, we're going to have to build a new church. And so they began discussing how they were going to build the new big church of Christendom, which would become St. Peter's Basilica. And I've been there, and it is amazing. I've actually been to both. Yes, I've been to St. Peter's Basilica, and I've been to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and they're both unbelievably spectacular in different ways. But what to me is interesting is, as someone who really admires the Byzantine Empire, how much the Hagia Sophia had been the heart of Christendom, and how from the broad spectrum, St. Peter's Basilica in its modern form is kind of newish. It's only been there for 500 years, whereas the Hagia Sophia had been there for almost 1,500 years. So to me, it was just fascinating. No one told me these things. I had to find out on my own. But I remember when I was at St. Peter's, man, there's a lot of statues in Rome, and especially near St. Peter's. In fact, there's statues all along the edge of the rooftop. There's statues on the top of columns, and they're like angels, and they're holding scepters and books, and they're all looking at you. And there's this bizarre, overwhelming feeling that you are watched and guarded over, like you are protected here. The sense of all these beings there watching. I don't know. It was pretty overwhelming and pretty amazing. I thought it was spectacular. So anyway, if anyone gets a chance to go see it, it's worth it. But anyway, all this stuff in Christianity, I had no clue about all of this. No one told me. You had to kind of go and find out on your own.
Well, that was the next question I was going to have, or next place to go with this. It seems no one engages with this today. I mean, this is not something that, now we've talked about this debate still going on. You can see the divisions of the churches and things like that. But
yes,
when you're talking about rebellion, sources of power for people, that this is very relevant to somebody in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries.
Right.
Today, this kind of stuff is next to not relevant. I mean, when you're walking around in the United States today, even the idea that this could be a problem is not something that is known to most people.
Right. Well, and that's why I had to understand it, because I was like, man, I mean, they're fighting each other in the streets, like, fisticuffs. What is this guy so pissed about? And why is he willing, what are they fighting over? Like, why is this so heated? And, there was a belief that if you got Jesus wrong, if you got it wrong, then you are completely misinterpreting the religion. And we can't allow that. That's why they had so many ecumenical councils. They're like, we need to solve this. We need to figure it out, because, if we're because what happened is, because Christianity was underground for almost 300 years, it was essentially decentralized Christianity. It was allowed to flourish in all these different forms, and probably in a healthy way, they were debating these things. What is the nature of Jesus? And one of the questions they would ask, who or what died on the cross? They're like, if Jesus is all divinity, who died on the cross? Because a divinity can't die. So you have to explain what died on the cross. What part of him died on the cross? So each denomination had to answer that question. Like, well, he's 100% human, and that's the part that died on the cross. Okay. And the other one's like, well, he's divine. He didn't really die on the cross because he comes back 3 days later. It was just a shell, whatever. So everyone had a different answer to even those questions, and stuff that we wouldn't even think about. And I was like, man, I could see, if you don't have this resolved, how these would be pretty tricky questions to answer. And the issue was, because of the decentralized nature of the discussions, you really had geopolitical regions that espoused different theories. So whoever you believed empowered Antioch. Oh, no, I changed my mind. I believe in this. Well, now you just empowered Rome. This guy believes in this. Well, now you're giving power to the patriarch in Constantinople. Oh, you believe that? Well, now Egypt's in charge. The Monophysites are calling the shots. Huge ramifications based on which story you believed. And so that's why it turned into persecution. You had to shut one of these stories down and end it, and try to come up with a hybrid story that reconciled most of what Christians thought to be true and made the most sense to the most people and empowered the right, people. It's important to have Rome included for the Byzantines, because Rome wasn't even part of the empire. So you're a Christian empire, you're a Christian Roman empire, and you don't have Rome and you don't have the Pope. That's a big problem. So they need it. That's why Justinian, in my story, he is like bent. He's like, we cannot exist as a Christian empire without Rome. We have to have Rome. He was super pro Rome. His big aim was to make sure that he's like, look, I don't care if the Monophysites don't like us. I don't care if the Nestorians have a problem. He's like, Pope, you and me, we got to see eye to eye. We have got to work this out. We've got to, East and West, we got to solve it. And his idea was, let's come up with a creed, a semantics that explains what you think and what a lot of people out here think. Let's figure this out. Because it was a problem, and it was the same problem that it was something called the Arcadian Schism, in which the Roman emperor, two Roman emperors before Justinian, sided with the Monophysites, and the emperor right before Justin's father became emperor was a Monophysite. So there was this Monophysite problem in Constantinople, and Justinian's like, no more Monophysites, Catholics. We're all Chalcedonians here, was kind of his thinking. And so he wanted to reconcile, and he mostly did. And I don't know how many people know this, but he ended up, Justinian sent armies back into Europe, reconquered Italy, Sicily, North Africa, parts of Spain, and reunited the Roman Empire for an entire generation. I didn't know that when I was a kid, but when I found that out, I was like, what? This guy reunited the Roman Empire? I was like, that's insane. So,
but it didn't stick.
Yeah, well, it didn't stick, but because I think the world had changed, he was still thinking like a Roman in antiquity. And on accident, he helped usher in the medieval era. If you look up when is the medieval era, the consensus is from 500 to 1500. That's the medieval era. And that's the Byzantine Empire, 1500 to 500 to 1500. So he created, and he's the one that Justinian, on top of all of this theological debate, you had the pagans still out there out of Athens going, I think y'all are crazy. What are you guys talking about? Christ is a divinity? What are we talking? So you had the Platonic view. And by the way, there was a massive effort in Christianity to reconcile Platonism with Christianity. They wanted a Platonic a Greek understanding of the world to mix with Christianity. So there was even an attempt, a hybrid, to reconcile the Greek school of thought with Christianity. But it was under Justinian that he closed the school of Athens. He's like, enough harassment by these university professors. I've had it. I'm closing you down. And that's widely seen as the end of paganism during Justinian's time. So
I don't remember. Sable says that one of the things that the last discussion spawned was a bit of an argument. I don't remember this, or whether there's an objective morality and how they might. I don't remember. Obvious objective morality is a deep philosophical subject beyond your stories. Would be interesting in your perspective on tackling such things.
Well, that's huge.
I don't remember Brianna and I being in that.
Well, that's interesting because I will say I do have a belief in what I would call inherent morality in storytelling. The nature of the story, and this is important.
This was going on in the Discord server. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry. We were talking about this was spawned in the Discord server based off the discussion with James Bacon. That was good and evil in storytelling. I had in my mind something that was coming from last Tuesday, since this is discussion. But yes, so from that discussion into the Discord, that's where that came from.
Yeah. Well, I think that morality is part of what makes us human. I mean, that's a very human thing. I think we were talking about it before with two rams or butting heads and one wins and mates. It's not right or wrong. It just happened. That one won. In humanity, in a human story, if this guy fights this guy and ends up marrying the princess, well, he better be the good guy, right? And we should be able to know that so that you kind of get this outgrowth of ethics as part of the story based on the choices and how those choices affect the world and other characters in the story. So I do think morality inherently comes out in stories and is open to interpretation to some extent. And I also think sometimes you get people trying to impose morality into stories, and that's when those stories get really weak. Like even in modern storytelling, sometimes they're like, representation is in and of itself moral. So they'll put all this diversity into 4th century England, and it doesn't make any sense. So it's like, no, diversity is a good idea and it should be relevant to story, but that doesn't mean it's moral. If you treat something that's moral when it's not moral, then the story will probably start to struggle a little bit. But I do think morality plays a part in storytelling. In fact, my I don't know if it's a theory on world building works with morality, but you need to understand the dimensions of it in order to build that world out. Need to understand what's at stake. Even I think Raiders of the Lost Ark, I used as an example. What do you do with a priceless artifact buried in the earth? One guy says use it for self aggrandizement. Find the cup of Christ for immortality. Find the Ark of the Covenant so you can rule the earth. And the other guy says, no, that belongs in a museum for educational purposes. So the answer to each of those questions inherently does lead to two moral, not just a moral answer, but a moral manifestation in behavior and action in life from one group or the other. So I do think that you can get morality out of morality. I think is hard to separate from stories. So I don't know if that answered the question or touched on it. And that could be a whole topic in and of itself.
That could be. That could be. That will have to be a discussion that follows from, yes, the good and evil in storytelling. Yes.
What Brianna say? I think both Heath and I felt that no, we didn't see good morals from the story of Jesus's birth or his death, but that's us coming from an atheistic perspective. Well, I think part of the idea of the story, just from a general standpoint, is that this man is significant. The story of his birth gives credence to the importance of him on earth. So if you believe that story, then you're likely to believe that Jesus is an important person. I think I was talking a while ago. I was like, of some of the horror stories, like The Exorcist. If you believe that, if that's scary, The Exorcist, because if you hold up a cross and the vampires or demons, like, well, that's proof that Christianity is the right religion. Otherwise, this is just a symbol that it couldn't harm evil, right? So that's a story that helps give credence to religion in a way, because it's the religion and the symbols and objects and understanding of the religion that is able to beat back evil. So sometimes the morality is in a sense inherent by reinforcing a moral code. And I think the nativity story reinforces the moral code of Christianity, that Christianity is not just an accident. It's because of this guy. And have you heard how this guy was born? Like, he's not just another guy. He's important. So I think from that sense, it gives credence. The story gives credence or credibility to Jesus as a person, as a being.
I'm sure we're going to come back to this topic when we talk more about the hero's journey specifically, because Brianna's been reading through the Hero 1000, Campbell's original text, and the Hero 1000.
It's a tough one, man.
And we're going to do that. So we're going to discuss that. But it occurred to me, so the similarities in the origin story and the virgin's birth, the miraculous births, and all of that show up in these kinds of stories. It occurred to me as you were talking here that when you're thinking about a hero, a great hero. What does a great hero often have? Like a magic weapon that's also really powerful and
the
really,
magic talisman.
Yeah. And so in one thing, you're like, well, now wait a minute. If this guy is this great hero, why would he even need this magic sword? Because he's already a great hero. Does his sword also have to be, infused with the power of thunder, or whatever it is that just the amazing sword that he's got? Because, can't he accomplish everything that he needs to do anyway, because he's just so great and powerful and wonderful anyway? Maybe yes, except for if you think about it from the opposite direction, you go, hey, here's this great, powerful weapon, sword, spear, whatever it is. What kind of person would have a weapon like that? Oh, a great hero. Like if you create this great weapon. Right. Somebody really important would have that. So it's looking at it from the other way. Yeah, like here's the most important sword. Who's got that? Oh, just that guy down the street. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. That guy's got it. No, a great hero would have it. So when you're talking about it could be the same kind of thing with the elements of the birth stories, that if you've got this, you say, well, couldn't Jesus do everything that he needed to do without all of these great elements of birth? Maybe. We said that 2 of the Gospels don't mention the miraculous birth anyway. But if you're going to have this great character, and you're going to have a great character would have a miraculous birth. And if you're going to have a miraculous birth, we didn't go through this miraculous birth to give birth to Joe. Now just doing whatever. That kind of thing would give birth to an important person. And an important person would have those elements of that birth. So it's possible. I'll be interested in looking as we go into Campbell more, that blending, that they don't they don't really separate. Or if you're right, tell this person he's not just anybody. He had this really cool birth story.
Well, and you're what we call it social proof today, like in marketing or in branding. You need social proof. Pepsi. This is great, and look, I got all these hot chicks around me. That's social proof. Drink this. 3 kings, 3 wise men came. This wasn't just because they said so. Like, other people gave credence to this. They came from far. They offered him gifts. Maybe it wasn't a magic sword, but it was gold and frankincense and myrrh. These are luxury items of the time. So all of it just gives credence to this greatness. And I think, to me, what makes the nativity story so compelling, especially when I try to put myself into the mindset back then, is all of this credence, all of this grandiosity brought all the way down into like I said, the equivalent of some guy's garage down the street. Like, it's so humble alongside such lofty notions. And I think that's part of the compelling nature of Christianity. Even the idea of killing a god on a cross. I mean, no one thought of that. That's a huge plot twist. You know, that we have this god, like people are like, Zeus sitting on a throne. You can't go stab Zeus. Zeus, Poseidon, these guys will knock you down. You can't do anything. You can't harm these guys. And here Christ dies on a cross. Like, it's so humbling. It's so human. It's so mortal. And yet it's also divine. So I think those two things kind of playing off each other, I think it is compelling. It's just naturally compelling. It's a humbleness alongside something unattainably divine.
The Sable Phoenix had brought something up when we were discussing Star Trek VI that I thought was really relevant to an analysis of these stories as well. And especially as I was looking at them from just a narrative perspective and trying to create a hybrid of them, or even just looking at a single one of them and trying to move through. And I'm thinking specifically here about Matthew and the star, for instance, but there are other examples of this as well. When the narrative doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes there'll be things that will happen that don't make a whole lot of sense, like the star appearing, yet nobody else following the star. It's a big deal, but it doesn't mention anybody else saw it. But it attracts the three kings, and then it disappears. Like, Herod obviously doesn't see it. If there's this big miraculous star over Christ's birthplace, Herod would be like, "Oh, look!" Like, but Herod apparently never saw it. And none of Herod nor any members of his court or things like that. Now, of course, it doesn't say that other people didn't see it, but like, that's a big question that you'd have just from the narrative perspective, is that it's there, and it attracts only the wise men that are explicitly, and then it vanishes again, because then the wise men are wandering around Jerusalem going, okay, we were following the star, but we're looking for it. And that's when they talk to Herod. And then after Herod, it reappears again and leads them to Bethlehem. So that's the kind of thing you're like, okay, so why didn't Herod see it? And why did it disappear? And what that, but instead of asking why, it was Sable Phoenix that asked or said that we should be asking what, instead of like, why is it like this in the story? And why is the story unfolding in this way? Analyzing it by asking, what is any of those elements doing in the story? So when you were talking about the kings, why are the kings coming in Matthew? Well, I mean, that could be, what is that doing for the story? Well, one thing that's doing for the story is that kind of outside validation.
I think those are major elements. Yeah.
That's one thing. Both the shepherds and the wise men come. Now, the shepherds may have been Jewish, because some people say, well, what is the shepherds coming? It's Christ coming to people. In this case, I guess people coming to, but it's going out into the world. This is the populace that is coming to Christ. This is going to be this religion. Whereas the wise men could be that, but they're also outsiders.
Well, and you again get the juxtaposition, wise men, wealthy men with lofty gifts alongside shepherds. It's like both are being appealed to, the upper crust and everyone else. Like, you get, both are there, both are represented.
I think that would be an important thing when you're talking about what does that do when you hybridize them. You have the idea of that. Why would you put both of those in the story? Well, it is the internal, the external, from inside. It's the wealthy, it's the poor, it's the ignorant and the educated. That is showing up there. Sable says, indeed. Why is just the mental itch. But why is still important, especially if you're trying to construct something that flows well as for a narrative. This happens, and that causes this to happen and so forth. And so you're looking for that. But I think you're right that what these elements represents is a much more useful question to get the weight behind it and the reasons for their existence. And also might help us examine why the elements that we typically say today are there. What are they doing for us that other things that get dropped? Like, for instance, hey, JDN, we don't really talk about John the Baptist that much. And Brianna brought that up. That's completely right. That's part of that story, the birth of John the Baptist. But I don't think I have ever been anywhere at Christmas when, like, the Christmas story is being talked about and like maybe once it was brought up. But it's there. That's clearly something that that Luke thought was important. And bringing these two characters together, associating them, Jesus and John the Baptist.
Well, and it goes to show the strength, the what that we were talking about. What is the function of this or that detail? It goes to show, like, Jesus is the star of the story. This story really hypes up the birth, the star, the wise men, the shepherds. The fact that Herod is hunting for him. Herod takes this as a serious threat. All of this lend credibility to Jesus as someone who is important, someone not just important to us, but also important to God, because he's the one we think about the most when we think of the nativity story. And some of these other stories, like you said, they fall off or become forgotten or just no focus on them. It just shows the power of storytelling when you're hyping up, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense, but when you're really stressing the importance of this birth, it's easy to see why people are like, man, this guy, and forget about some of these other things because they've really done their homework with all these other devices in the story that tell you that this guy is important. This guy's the star. And it's awesome. Even did you know that the book Ben-Hur begins with the nativity story?
I did not know that.
You should almost read just the opening. It's so beautifully written. It's told from the perspective of the wise men. Kind of follows them as they decide to move to Bethlehem. But anyway, it is such a good story. It's archetypal. Like, I think it does capture the imagination pretty strongly. Just like the parting of the Red Sea with Moses. I mean, who can forget that? So. These mythical biblical stories tend to stay with us. They give credence to the religion. And Heath, I was going to ask you, what made you zero in on this story? Like, you picked the nativity story, but you also picked, the massacre in Bethlehem, which is, to be honest, I didn't even really know much about it at all. What made you pick that? Like out of all the stories.
Okay, great question. Well, and also an angel focus. I mean, the main character being Gabriel.
I love that.
We're looking at this from the perspective of angels and from heaven. This idea of writing a story about the nativity, the Christmas story, from the perspective of the angels was one of the very first ideas that came to me. And I think I was about in 10th grade, the first time I really had an idea about warrior angels, when that I encountered, warrior angels, and it stuck with me throughout life. And this is going forward with even more stories now. Because I guess there were two things that kind of clued me into the angels thing. One was a book on heraldry that I was given as a kid that has a whole chapter on the heraldry of heaven. And I think that was the first time that I had encountered like warrior angels, because it was describing the depictions of warrior angels in medieval art and medieval heraldry, and also the heraldry that the medieval heralds, the coats of arms, the medieval heralds would attribute even to angels. Like to Michael or Gabriel, the attributed arms of Michael and the attributed arms of Gabriel. And I think that's when I came up with the idea that even that the classic, or you realize that the classic depiction of an angel, a lot of people comes from the nativity set. I mean, that was one of the things that, nativity sets are physical, especially as a kid, setting up the nativity set's a big deal. And what's an angel? An angel is the teenage girl that's sitting on top of the stable. That's what an angel is. And so I guess when I then encountered this idea of warrior angels, and that, hey, angel as teenage girl wasn't really something that was in the Bible. That's not there. There was no Alita. Right. That was fascinating to me. And I'm not sure which one came first, but there was that line on angels that came in. And then there was also Dake's annotated reference Bible, which I think I've talked about before on different streams. But this was a particular Bible that my grandfather had. He was a Southern Baptist preacher, and that when I was going to church and Sunday school, I would be sitting in the back seat, and his Bible and his Bible would be sitting in the back seat with me. And for some reason, I picked that up and started reading that because it's got all these different references on the sides for different things. And that one talked about a pre-Adamite civilization. It was giving the references, the biblical references for the idea that there was an entire civilization that was ruled by Lucifer prior to the creation of Adam. And I was like, whoa, this is fascinating. I've never,
Wow.
Why don't we ever talk about that? Now, whether or not it's true or not, I mean, that's irrelevant to this discussion. But I was like, man, so wait a minute. We've got at least some interpretation of these texts where you have this, you have a civilization of other humans on Earth that's ruled by angels, and that when Lucifer was at his height, and this is where the fall comes from, and that when you pick up with the water, the earth was without void, the earth was without form, and water was on the face of the earth, that this is supposed to be a destructive flood that Lucifer sent to the earth to destroy it as part of his scorched earth policy after the War of the Fall. And that everything that happened with Adam and Eve was a recreation and God trying to get the earth back in order after this cataclysmic war that the angels had fought over the earth. And I thought, gee, well, we should talk about that. So those two, I guess that book on heraldry and that idea came together to put what's becoming the whole story arc of theophany in my mind.
Wow.
And so that's why I love the idea of warrior angels. But before I had that whole arc, I was like, well, now, wait a minute. We could tell the Christmas story rather than the teenage girl angel up above the nativity. Let's tell this as if we've got warrior angels, together in a militaristic kind of culture. And so as I first did this, the version of the story was published in the school literary magazine in 10th grade.
Oh, really?
Terrible. Yeah. So my first iteration of this, I mean, I think it was good. I mean, good for the time, but I was like, I've always remembered that. And I was like, I really should get that out to a wider audience. But it was basically just a sequence of events. It only went from, it did start in heaven with God announcing that he was going to be born into the world. And then it basically just went through all of the sequence of events and ended on Christmas night.
Okay.
But I just basically told all of the different classic biblical, classic nativity events.
And that's a classic writing, like mistake, not mistake, but like what you do when you first start writing.
Right.
What's the next logical step? And you just write that. And then what's the next logical step? And just writing the next logical step isn't always the best storytelling.
Well, right. And that goes into, well, in this case, you do have, it's an adaptation. So, at that time, I wasn't going to do something really weird. It was intended to be, what do you read in the Gospels? Okay, I'll rewrite that from the perspective of an angel. I actually had a bunch of different angels and the different types of angels in it. So it was different in that regard.
Wow.
And then I didn't even include the wise. I included the wise men. They saw the star that night, and they got on their camels to start heading to Jerusalem or get to Bethlehem. But I was like, that's a separate story. That's Epiphany. I'll not tell that. And so the story just ended with the birth on the night. And then that was it. So when I decided to return to this story, I was like, all right, I got to do I want to do my Christmas story. This is going to be the first one. Going back to the beginning, this is the first one that I had thought about. I want to tell it and I want to get it out. The first thing I realized is when we were talking about, that we've talked about a lot on this, is that a sequence of events is not a story. That
right.
I could retell the sequence event. Of course, I think there are only 2 sentences in the story now that was the same as in 10th grade. So it was basically a complete rewrite. It wasn't like, let me sit down and edit this. It was like, oh my God, I got to completely rewrite this. It's basically a complete rewrite. But that the sequence of events didn't tell a story. And we talked about that we want to have some type of theme. We've been talking about today that maybe if you're just talking about the birth of Christ, you're just hearing the beginning of the story, or maybe the middle of the story, or whatever, that this is just one part that's in some kind of greater context, that when you have it, you'll have some type of greater message and theme that maybe. But in this case, I was intending it to be, okay, this is supposed to be a standalone thing, like a short story that you're supposed to sit down and read. Therefore, even if it doesn't have, shall we say, a classic story structure, because it's still an adaptation of the events. I wanted it to be an adaptation of the events of the Gospels.
Right.
And I was like, I really need it to have some kind of arc, some type of theme to wrestle with, so that it is standalone, even if the nativity isn't. This has to be a standalone story. This is
right.
So when I started tackling it from that perspective, I realized that just ending on Christmas night, which is again what I thought it would be, but instead of just ending on Christmas night, it did really the story went through Epiphany, the arrival of the Magi and the massacre of the innocents, and maybe slightly further, but that was an important part of this arc, and that was what was giving this story some oomph. A massacre of children is, first of all, not something that you often hear about for Christmas. It's not something that you engage with for Christmas all that often, and it's dramatic. I mean, this is a major set piece moment if you were doing it as a movie or something like this massacre that's going to take place. It's born out of things that you don't see all that often. Warrior angels, this perspective, and then also an element of the Christmas story that's not told and not wrestled with for different reasons that Brianna and I had potentially described. That, it's not as relevant. It is, yes, I think it is recalling Moses, the death of all of the children. It's got that same kind of element to it, like we were talking about that Matthew was trying to bring up, associating Jesus and Moses. I added more of that stuff in there. Like when they're making the flight to Egypt, I called out specifically that Gabriel packs them unleavened bread to further make it more Moses-like, that they have to leave so fast they've got to take care of like 3 other things I added.
I love that
are Moses references back to Jesus. So playing that up from the perspective of Matthew. But then when I was thinking about the theme, I didn't really have one in the beginning, because I was just trying to recount. Let me just do this adaptation and recount these events. And I got to this. I noticed the second half of the story. So the second half of the story is now what had been the end of the story, Christmas night, becomes the middle of the story as I'm telling it now. And then the second half is after the birth of Christ. Gabriel became very passive in my first draft of this, because Gabriel has got a lot of stuff to do biblically, in the beginning. I got to go talk to Joseph. I got to go talk to Mary. And I made him the angel also that shows up and sings the song to the shepherds. So he's got a lot of stuff to do in the beginning of that. But then after that, he does kind of not do much in the gospel. And so he wasn't doing very much in my first draft. And I had recounted the events. And then I had gotten to the end of the massacre. And I realized, I think I might have texted you. I know I texted Brianna. I was like, well, I just finished my draft, went back and reread it all, and boy, it is not working. And one of the major problems was that Gabriel wasn't active. The main character had become...
He's got to be engaged. Yeah.
He's got to be engaged, right? So that's a huge thing, that if you're not working, the more active your main character is, the better. As far as the storytelling and the structure goes, I found that oftentimes if you're not liking the story, it might be because the main character has become too passive. But so that had definitely happened here. But I was sitting there with this massacre going, why did this happen? Like, why did God even let this happen? If you're going to accept it as part of the story, like you need, you can say it from an academic perspective. Oh, this is something that's added in, like Brianna and I talked about, something that's added in that, is associating Jesus with Moses. Don't think about it too much beyond that. What it's doing, I guess that'd be what it was doing, is making that association, making that association. You're not really supposed to get into it beyond that, maybe. But its absence of discussion is important to me. Like the reason that we don't talk about that is also important to me. And so I said, well, why did God let this happen? What purpose is it? If you're going to take it seriously as part of the story, what is it actually supposed to do for you? And I realized that was the question that I was supposed to be dealing with. Like, as I wrote it out, I was like, I'm the author. Like, I've got to figure out why this happened. And for a little while, as in like 20 minutes or something, I was like, so that's the question that the audience is going to be left with. Why did something like this happen? And I realized, no. That's my job as the author to try to come up with some type of explanation as to why this happened. And then let the ramifications of that needs to be, what the audience takes away. That's actually the question I'm supposed to solve. And so it was at that point that it might have been at that point that the whole character of Sataniel, who's the angel that tortured Job, appeared in the story. And then I went back and I rewrote the whole thing with this arc, making Gabriel active and dealing with the massacre of the innocents seriously. And trying to figure out how you handle that seriously, especially when I'd already established that we have very competent and capable angels. Gabriel himself right there. How does something like this happen? And I realized that it was sort of the inverse of the Job story. That Job is about, why do bad things happen to good people? Sometimes it's because heaven is doing them to you in order to test you. This one was, so that was more about heaven's action. Heaven might be taking action against you that's making your life terrible as a test. Here is something where heaven chooses not to act. So here, heaven's inaction. They could have stopped something, and something really terrible happened to innocent people. The
non-intervention.
Non-intervention leads to this. So I was trying to wrestle with that, and so the theme of that emerged from the writing and struggling with the questions that I had as an author. Rather than something I sat down to put in, that's what emerged as I was writing and made it a single story.
That's interesting. And I think, not knowing your first version, like I didn't know about the other attempt. So I guess in a way I wasn't aware of what you were trying to solve. I just read the near final version of it. There is an arc, and you mentioned Job. You have that discussion about Job early on in heaven. Which I thought was great because you develop Sataniel's character, Gabriel's character. There's that one line where he's ready to go to war for God. The warrior mentality. He's like, I'll get the chariot for you, and God's like, whoa, more of peace, less of war. But it's like this new idea that God had. Another question I had was the first, and this was probably one of the first questions I had while reading it was. Why did you choose the spelling of Sataniel? Why did you go with that spelling of it?
Where does that character specifically show up? Now, all of my angels have their names end in EL. So I put that on there, the EL, because EL is a suffix that means the radiant being. So all of the angels have their name end in EL. Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, all of your classic angels end in EL.
Right.
So Sataniel comes from, but that if Satan is opponent, the opponent of God, which it never actually said, that never gives his name in Job. I just attributed that. So this is the radiant being who is the opponent of God, and he's still part of heaven's court.
Yeah. No, and by the way, one thought, like I said, I didn't know how I was going to react, but when I first read it, but I was like, Heath has set a pretty high bar for himself. He's trying to take these almost, Sataniel, God, Saint Gabriel, these are some pretty big names in the pantheon of characters, or beings in the world. And I thought your ability to characterize them was very good.
Thank you.
I thought that Sataniel, you had him constantly, just like almost effortlessly, unconsciously, like spreading doubt and, I don't know, you could have, that wasn't a good idea, or didn't you mess that up before? And like just constantly putting people kind of off balance with everything he was saying. It was pretty consistent. So it was really good. But it was interesting. I like that you used the spelling that you did, because I think if you just wrote like Satan, it would have stuck out so much, because it's such a charged word that by calling him Sataniel, it did kind of like smooth that name out, and it was like I got my impression of him as among his peers of angels.
Well, and I also wanted to specifically contrast him and Lucifer.
Right.
Because if I'd said Satan, a lot of people would have also said,
you're
talking about the devil. And so this character, I mean, there's a lot of different discussions about what exactly the character was in Job anyway.
Right.
I call him the advocatus diaboli, the advocate of the devil, which is the position in the Catholic Church when you're debating whether or not someone should become a saint. The person who argues against that as position there is the is the advocate of the devil, which is where we get that from, which is why I put that in, which I said was going to be different from Lucifer, which, by the way, Lucifer does not have the EL. That was a problem when I've been writing other things in this, because all the angels are supposed to have the EL suffix, and then Lucifer doesn't. And that's, he's the light bringer. But actually, you go back and it's Hillel. It worked out perfectly, because if you look at, I think it was part of Isaiah that's translated, you end up with his name as Hillel, Hellel, which has that. And
right.
So in the story, then now in this book, because I said this was kind of standalone, so it's sprinkled with the theophany that I've been building, but and informed by it, but it's kind of outside. It's outside of its main narrative. That's why I went ahead and just used the word Lucifer in here, because everybody would know exactly what that was, who that was, to contrast Sataniel and Lucifer. But it was interesting that Hillel, which apparently some denominations or whatever will use that, like Hillel, as the unfallen Lucifer. So Satan is of God, means of God.
I see what you're saying. Yep, that's cool.
Yeah, and Brianna's right. So we did talk about that, making the massacre of the innocents, making the association with Moses, and it does fix the Bethlehem Nazareth problem. That how do we get him from Bethlehem to Nazareth if you're trying to work with these different stories? Because he leaves Bethlehem, the flight into Egypt, and then they go to Nazareth after that. And my point, so it does do that. It's the mechanism for that. But my point was, if that was just the point, you didn't have to have all the kids die. Like, you could have had Herod after him, and Gabriel could have also gotten the other children out. It could have been several kids who all went to Egypt, and then they would have been afraid, and they could have gotten to Nazareth. So yes, that overall, but the fact that the death actually happens is
what were some of the hardest parts to adapt? Like if because you cover some ground. So which parts were the most difficult to adapt, like from this like ancient story to trying to tell a narrative from a modern sense? Where was the biggest struggle?
Okay, well, aside from finding some kind of theme to run through this, that's in order to make it into a modern story, the star, and I found this because I was like, that plot hole of, as you're sitting there writing, and you're wondering how much are other people going to notice the different kinds of plot holes like that, because that's when I was realizing, why doesn't Herod just take a look at that star? Like, why doesn't anybody else? Like, what is going on?
You can find him. It's like the GPS of the time.
Yeah. Why didn't, or even the Emperor of Rome, or all of the other people that are around. I mean, it doesn't say anybody else comes. So why is that? What is that doing? This narrative doesn't really address why nobody else shows up, but it did have, need to come, or, it also skips over why is it that Herod doesn't see it. And it does lead to this massacre. The star is what leads to the massacre, sets this chain of events into, sets this chain of events going that ends up in the massacre. And I thought, well, how do you handle that? But actually the answer came from the Jehovah's Witness theology, because people think of the Star of Bethlehem being something very holy. Like, that's why it's up there on your nativity set, the holy light that's shining down on the manger, giving everyone, light to see by in the evenings. But it does lead directly to this massacre, or starts the chain of events that leads to this massacre. And so the Jehovah's Witness, therefore, think that it was Satan who created that star. So I have Sataniel do that. He's like, gee, God wouldn't have created that star. They think of which is completely different from how I've ever heard of it. They think of the Star of Bethlehem as something satanic because it leads to the death of the innocents. And they're saying God would never have created something like that would have ended in the massacre of the innocents. So they actually say that Satan created the Star of Bethlehem. And I'd never heard that before.
Interesting.
So trying to blend these different things that have the story gaps, so trying to create a narrative that I didn't just go by Matthew, I didn't just go by Luke. So the first thing is you try to blend these stories,
right?
Like Brianna and I talked about, that really don't have all that much in common. But nonetheless, I wanted, because it's a modern story, what do you think about? You think about wise men, you think about shepherds, you think about the manger. Okay, so all those have to be in the story, and you got to integrate them in some way that makes sense. But some questions are just left unanswered. Like, why didn't Herod look at the star? Well, I never came up with an answer. So hopefully other people don't think about that until I just brought it up.
Yeah. So, well, and that's part of writing when you're trying to fictionalize an account. You have to choose what's important to your story too. And sometimes you might try to address something like that and it slows the story down, or it doesn't really augment it, or it complicates. So you leave it out. So some of those are just narrative choices.
Well, sometimes, right, when you're thinking about plot holes and plot problems, just in stories in general, and you're talking about movies, sometimes when people are doing the analysis, they'll say, this seems like this is a problem that people are wondering about. And it could have been fixed by just somebody saying one line of dialogue.
Right.
At some point, sometimes those fixes are that easy. That like, somebody just needs to say something and give that explanation. Then just nobody will think about it anymore, and we'll just go on, and that's the reason. Other times it requires a lot more to figure out. And when you're doing an adaptation, I guess this is a difference between doing an adaptation and if you're trying to create your own work entirely. Maybe I'm more forgiving of that if you're trying to do an adaptation. When, all right, this happens, people know this, and this. Why didn't other people see the star? Well, is it worth it in the story of the Nativity to go into to come up with some type of explanation and then write it in, and it may go too long. And you know what? If we don't say that, people will probably not even notice anyway, because that's the way the story's been told for 2,000 years, or whatever. So probably that just isn't something that people are thinking about, and so they'll accept it. And you got to make that call. So yeah, going into a diatribe about that, or even like Brianna's talking about the Bethlehem Nazareth situation.
Right.
Because I've got, so the wise men come to Bethlehem because in Matthew, they're just always in Bethlehem. That's just where they live. And then they get to Nazareth by way of the threat. They leave and they come back. In Luke, of course, you've got them in Nazareth. They come to Bethlehem because of the Roman decree. And then they go do the circumcision, the temple and things. And they go back to Nazareth. So I wanted to have both. And it is the massacre at Bethlehem. It couldn't become the massacre in Nazareth. It's in Bethlehem. So in this story, it's the weird part of the hybrid. They are in Nazareth. You've got the Roman decree. They show up in Bethlehem, have the birth. Presumably, Joseph goes and fills out his census form the next day, or like while he's there. But then apparently in that story, they just decide, you know what, Bethlehem, this is kind of a nice place. So they must like buy a house or something. They're like, we came here because we need to fill out a tax form. But come to think of it, we just decided to stay.
They have lower property taxes, no citywide tax.
And I suppose if you were constructing the story from the beginning, or if you were not trying to, you're right. Or if you were not trying to hybridize them, you wouldn't worry about that. But I was like, what do I do? And I just accepted it and moved on.
Yeah. Well, you got to make those choices. You got to, especially when you have competing versions of the same story or different accounts or variations of a story, you kind of have to figure out what you think was the most likely, and then characterize it and portray it as you envision it. Because a lot of times, especially like it happens with historical fiction, people who are in the know, who really understand all the different competing stories and everything, they're going to want to know which route you picked. They're going to want to see how you solved it, and some of them might even admire your solution to the problems. Because you're kind of secretly doing that when you're writing these. You're reconciling competing issues as you choose your one path through your story.
So and then also, like, how much do you get into the mind of God? And I decided kind of little, because when I was trying to figure out, okay, when I realized the theme of the story is why do bad things happen to good people, and I'm dealing with that, and I got to address, why does Gabriel not act? Why does Gabriel not do something to stop this atrocity that's about to occur? Well, okay, he's under orders not to, and that brings in the themes of free will. Also prophecy versus free will, is also in this. So that brought in the sub theme of prophecy and free will when you're thinking about why.
And hardening a heart.
Hardening the heart, yes, that was also brought in. Brought that into Mary's choice and will there as well. So free will is through this as well. But okay, Gabriel's operating under orders. This is a virtue for an angel. You do what you're told. Do you do what you're told even when the result is an atrocity? That's the kind of question that comes up. But why does God want it that way? In a sense, it's an unresolvable problem. I mean, that general question, why do bad things happen? The problem of evil. It's just God wants it that way. At the end of the end of this day, God wants it that way. So I can resolve it for Gabriel, and I can have that be something that Gabriel is wrestling with. What is he going to do? What would you have done in Gabriel's situation? Sataniel says that Lucifer would have done differently, for different reasons. What would have been the situation here? But ultimately, it goes back to God. Well, God wanted it that way. Well, why? Well, ultimately, that's an unanswerable question. But I thought it was okay, as far as the story goes, to leave it to an unanswerable, to throw it back on God, because that's the only thing you can do.
Well, and most of us will understand that we might not get the answer because only God knows. We accept that.
Well, that's Brianna says God wants it that way. Moral action is obedience. This is a discussion we will go into more depth if when. Yeah, if when. We will, but when, that's the question. We ever get to talk about Paradise Lost. Oh, God, there's so much stuff to read, and that one's going to be a heavy one to get into. And there's this still my stack like this big of stuff to read for everybody.
Well, and one of the moral conundrums that you always run into is maybe the massacre is preferable to another course of event, which would have been even worse. Like when they were talking with Japan and dropping nuclear weapon, atomic bombs on Japan. It was like, well, the alternative is we invade the island with 1 million Marine or whatever it called for. And they're like, is that moral? Is that better? Should we not have dropped should we invaded and lost more American? So, you get the idea of one evil over another and one is less, you get that concept. And that one's invoked a lot in history anyway.
And we can say this probably would have happened, but we're limited as humans. Like, we don't really know what would have happened. I mean, what if we don't do this, which is what we did, if we hadn't done that, what would have happened? Well, sometimes we have better ideas than, other times.
Yeah.
But at least you could say, if it's God is all knowing. So he must know exactly what would have happened on that side.
We don't get it.
It must have been worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Paradise Lost is over the top. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. Brant says that's basically how Paradise Lost frames morality. Might makes right, obey or be condemned. Which is obedience. That's the theme that comes up in we've got to read it through. I know. At some point I was thinking about this and I was like, I was telling Doug that when I start something, I just get into it and I want to finish it. So I need to just set aside the time and be like, what I'm doing is getting into this book and start just chewing through all of the books. Faraway Bird, going through Faraway Bird. Cameron,
that one's a great book, by the way.
Faraway Bird, also amazing. Yeah, I've started it. So
awesome.
Faraway Bird has been started. But I need to say that, all right, now what I'm doing right now is just Faraway Bird. And then instead of trying to say, 20 minutes of reading a day, I need to be like, all right, this book.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've started Faraway Bird.
Awesome, man. Shoot, I was going to say something. Totally forgot. Anyway, keep going.
Well, I mean, I think we might be coming to kind of a natural kind of stopping point for this auxiliary one, unless there are you say other topics that we need to address. I hit all of my notes that I had come up with based on our discussion from last Tuesday, kind of as an extension here.
Yeah.
Maybe one day we'll get to do like Genesis or the guy who kills his brother. All of a sudden,
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, yes, Cain and Abel. There are other kinds of the stories that maybe we can look at those two.
Well,
I know.
Listen, I think it's great. Like I said, while reading The Trial of St. Gabriel, it just reminded me how compelling these stories are. And, how when you try to unpack them, it is amazing how much stuff is there. And even like what Brianna's saying, the idea of obedience as virtue, obviously that cannot be an absolute. But there are, in a military hierarchy, which you're depicting the angels in this portrayal as warrior angels, obedience is a virtue. There is always the caveat that there's an immoral order and the soldier is not bound to obey it. But you better be right. You disobey and you get you think about Black Hawk Down when that guy ignored his order and he's like, we are combat ineffective.
Right. Oh yeah.
You could disobey and F things up pretty quick in a military sense. So, the idea of obedience is that all the onus, all the responsibility for the decision is on the decision maker. So by obeying, it's my fault for giving the order is kind of the, if I'm in charge. So there is logic to it. Obviously there is a necessity for it, but it certainly has a flaw as an absolute.
You had mentioned Mary, because there's just one more thing to mention that because Mary is there, and I dealt with Barry and her free will as I was writing that. Like, what is the story in here? They do early in the story have the idea that perhaps the pregnancy is just the mere existence of the pregnancy is going to kill her. That contact with the divine is going to kill her. Oh. And I thought in the beginning that was one of the themes that. Or one of the big questions, like, will this kill her? Like, can you survive contact with the divine? Which also isn't something that we really talk about today, because people talk about like personal relationships with God a lot. I just talk to God personally, have this personal relationship, which is not the way that early Christians saw it, or Jewish traditions. There's protocols, there's regulations about what you do when you interface with God. Like, you can't just go, if you're going into the tabernacle or things like that, you can't just, I'm going to, because you're sinful, which is not the way that a lot of people think about today. You're sinful, you're corrupt. God is holy and perfect. You can't just go and talk to him. Doug, you all right? We need to stop. We need to wrap up anyway. You need something to drink.
Sorry, I just had I had a little bit of a tickle, and it keeps coming back.
But because Mary, goes on the story rather early, goes on the story that's resolved rather early. But I went ahead and left that in because it's something that I don't think it's something that people think about now, because everybody's talking about personal relationship. But all of these earlier thinkers wouldn't like. That's even like intercessory prayer. When you're like, well, I'm just going to pray to God. But then you think, oh, do Catholics pray to saints? But it's often I'm going to ask this saint to take my prayer to God, because the saint can approach God.
They can handle it.
I'm just me down here. That kind of thing, because God being holy and perfect, that isn't something that I can't even be in his presence, and I can't survive contact with him. That was the idea, what I was thinking about with this idea about, man, can you even put perfect holiness and divinity inside a woman's body?
Yeah. Well, and that goes to that idea of, divinity plus humanity, which is what Christianity in a sense introduced. What does that mean? And like you said, that's another question. Is it dangerous? I remember I was watching Oppenheimer recently, and, there was that fear that by lighting off the nuclear bomb, they would light the atmosphere on fire. There's this idea of a high stakes encounter or a high stakes interaction. like I said, like you said, these aren't thought of today because we, in essence, reconciled or answered all the questions in the past, and we're just told kind of like, you can pray to this, you can do this, you can do this. There's a Trinity, there's that. We don't question it. We don't realize that they can be questioned, or that these were discussed in great depth at one point in the past, and that the scope of those discussions could have been epic, and we missed out on all that.
All right. Well, let's Doug, I'll conclude with Trial of St. Gabriel, but first of all, Doug, everybody, first of all, get Faraway Bird. We are going to cover it on this channel. I appreciate your talking about Trial of St. Gabriel with me, Doug, today. So we're going to talk about Faraway Bird. Return the favor. We'll talk about Faraway Bird. So if you want to get it, I need to do some more planning and put stuff on the schedule, but I'll let people know as well. So if you want to get Faraway Bird, get it. Eventually, we will have it on the schedule if you want to read it before we actually discuss it.
And I'll let it is available on audible.com. So there is an audiobook version, and there is original music that was written. Like right when you hit play, you'll hear Lucy's music. It's like this choral music that she wrote. A lot of the music at the time were written by men. So we had this idea that we were going to, what would Christian music from the 6th century written by a woman sound like? That was kind of the idea behind it. So she wrote music, and it came out really good. So it's a good experience. It's more than just narration. If you like audiobooks, if you want to read it like that. So.
We should definitely be talking about that more. I will talk to you later about a project. And I was thinking about the music, and I'd forgotten that you had done custom music. Because that's really interesting, because how important that is. So now, actually, I really need to listen to this audio production.
Yeah, so, I had she was a sex performer. So there's a scene where there's a live sex show, basically, and I literally had to write lyrics to like this pagan sounding mantra. Or this pagan, it was about the idea of knocking over one religion and claiming it, kind of thing. So I wrote all these lyrics out, like, and put it in there. It's real simple stuff, but Lucy also wrote a melody for that, and the narrator had to listen and learn the melody to sing it into the story. So anyway, there's just some cool stuff in there that goes just beyond just narration. That's all.
Well, we need to talk more about that. So get now I got to listen to that. So maybe the audiobook is the way to get that done.
I'm always a big fan of audiobooks, but sometimes if you're like my mind, it depends. If I'm focused, audiobooks will go in and I have 1000% comprehension. If I'm distracted at all, though, I miss way too much. So it's hit or miss for me.
James says Douglas Burton, author of historical fiction and pagan sex ritual expert, sex ritual songwriter. Right.
James, those were the titles I dreamed of one day when I was a kid.
So there's no audiobook of Trial of St. Gabriel yet. Maybe next Christmas is one to do, because I got my goal done of getting the story written and getting it on Kickstarter. So we'll have audiobooks and we'll have the physical book of this. So this is a major accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this discussion, I really hope that you will come over. Somebody came in. We got a backer. I noticed I think we were at 19 when this started.
Oh,
so
awesome.
Somebody came here. If you're watching now, or if you are watching on replay, if you've enjoyed this and I enjoyed hearing me talk about it, I would love to have you over on the Kickstarter. The ebook's only $4. So you can come in, and just get the ebook, $4. If you want to get a physical copy, then I will be having those printed up. But it's just $4. So come on over, and I would love to have you. And then you can talk about it with your family.
Totally worth it.
All right. Thank you so much, Doug.
Oh, yeah. You got it, Heath. This was totally great conversation. You don't get these kind of conversations just anywhere on YouTube. So, and then to have the kind of people that come into the chat room who can contribute at such a high level with more knowledge than you and me on very specific topics and law, it's quite a treat. So even when I miss a stream, I like to go back and listen to it.
Actually, we should even say that this right here is well, there we are. We're live. But right here, this is the channel, 956 subscribers. So we're still dual streaming right now. But if you are watching over on Heath's Geekverse, please do come over here to the main Table Talk channel and like and subscribe, because we got 956 subscribers. We're closing in on 1,000. Closing in on 1,000.
And it happened quick. So there's
you.
some organic growth happening all on its own. I notice a lot of your clips and some of the other streams are getting a lot more views than we used to get. So it's really nice to see that growth. And it's nice. We get contributions from, like, I was listening to the last stream on the Christmas story, and Brianna's commentary and questions and thoughts and angles were totally unique and original. And Cameron providing an Islamic perspective on that. Like, you just don't get that anywhere. So it's nice to have such a broad range of and diverse thinking.
So thank you to everybody who's been watching live and on replay and making the channel grow. This has been fantastic. All right. Later, everybody. I got to go cook and clean house. So
Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody.
Later.